All right, well, let me introduce and invite the panel to come up here, and I'll introduce myself, and then I'll let each person introduce themselves. Stefano, if you can come up. Nolan Leek, right over here. Chris Price and Chris Wright. I hope. Chris Wright and Chris Price. Great. Have a seat. Nope. Cool. Sit wherever you'd like. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Neil Jacques. I'm the executive director of the OpenDaylight project. And as Jim was sharing, one of the interesting things that we see when we look across the IT industry is that in general, open source and I would say collaborative efforts have really made huge waves across each piece of the IT industry. And networking has been one that I would say has been slower to adopt this more collaborative approach. And what's interesting is, as Jim was saying, a couple of years ago, we really started to see that change. And I think one of the key reasons that this started to change was this major shift that was happening in networking towards more centralized control. Because the industry realized that we need to have programmable networks. The programmable networks are a key to so many different use cases, so many areas of innovation that are going on in the space. And that unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on where you sit, unfortunately, no one player was powerful enough to be able to impose their own view on the rest of the industry to create a platform. And that the only way that we were going to get a platform was to get real collaboration. This has been true certainly at the control plane level, and others might argue it's actually been true at other areas of the networking stack. And so I'm actually very excited to be sitting here with 4 top luminaries in the open networking movement. Each of these individuals can represent and does represent a critical project in being able to do this, because it's not just one technology, one player, or even one open source project that's going to change the industry. And so with that, I'd like to start with Stefano, and you can start by introducing yourself, say a little bit about who you are, what you do, and who you're representing.
Right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Stefano Maffulli. I've started advocating free software and open source since Windows 3.1 came out, and was a huge disappointment, and that led me to look for better ways of using or producing software, writing software. And since then, I've had fun poking Microsoft in the EU, and after that, gone through lots of disappointing experiences through using Linux distributions on the desktop. Unfortunately, I don't believe that war has been lost. I guess I'm ready to declare bankruptcy, but we're winning other wars. And I'm right now developer advocate for about 3,000 developers contributing to OpenStack at the OpenStack Foundation.
Excellent. Nolan?
Thank you. I'm Nolan Leek. I've been a Linux user on the desktop continuously since 1995, so I'm not sure that battle's completely lost yet, but and I also used it heavily on servers as well, and so I co-founded Cumulus Networks because I was concerned that I couldn't have a similar kind of both openness and operational model on network switches. And so we then built a Linux for that.
My name is Chris Wright. I'm the chief technologist at Red Hat, and I've been involved in open source for quite a long time. I too am a Linux desktop user, have been for as long as I can remember, really. But from a networking point of view, I'm involved in the OpenDaylight project. I'm also involved in OPNFV, and what we're excited about is how we can bring all of the methodologies and sort of light up a whole new space in networking that reflects all of the advances we've done, some of which Stephen mentioned in his keynote about scale and management that we see in the server space that has just been stagnating on the networking side.
I'm Chris Price. I firmly grounded in the networking industry. Worked for Ericsson for a long time. I work as well as Chris in OpenDaylight and OPNFV. Currently focused a lot on OPNFV. It really is one of those truly collaborative projects, and we'll probably get into that later, but really interested in driving the technologies we see in virtualization and in scale and bringing that into the networking industry, into the service provider industry, and yeah.
Great. Thank you. So pretty interesting panel here, right? We've got somebody representing OpenStack, somebody representing Open Compute Project and ONI, somebody representing both OpenDaylight and or two people representing both OpenDaylight, OPNFV, and you've had some hand in the development of Linux. So I think we've got a pretty interesting group of folks. I wanted to start with two questions that I got a lot when I started my role just almost a year and a half ago. One of the questions I got from lots of senior executives at companies in the network industry was they looked at me and they said, you know, we get Linux, and that was a neat little project, but why do we need open source in our industry? Because, you know, we have to pay developers, we've got to hire developers, we've got to make money. Things seem to be going relatively well. Why do we need this change? This seems complicated, this seems hard. So I'd love to sort of open it up to no one in particular, but why do you think that we need open source in networking and I guess in cloud also?
So I mean, from my perspective, you know, I tend to take a fairly low-level hardware point of view, but without having that openness at the very lowest levels, it's very difficult to innovate at the levels above, right? I mean, you know, with Linux as a server operating system, if I'm building a large distributed application on top of that, I can kind of look down at the kernel and see how it operates. I can get that visibility into what it's doing that I couldn't do if I didn't have that source code. And on top of that, I can actually make changes if it's not doing what I need. And so, you know, in the traditional networking model, there's been this just utterly opaque lower level that, you know, you have a very constrained way of interacting with, and it limits what you can do.
I would agree with that. I think the limitation is played into the advantage of the vendors who have a vertically integrated stack, so it builds a kind of a locked-in environment, but that's really at the disadvantage of the users, and the users' environments have fundamentally changed. At one point in time, it was rack stack, you're at the scale of how quickly you can plug a server into a network port in your data center, and that's just fundamentally not true anymore. You've got applications that come and go in you know, essentially instantaneously, each of which create pressure on the network to deliver a different kind of service, and to do that without having programmability and flexibility that's just not been there when it's a vertically integrated stack it's not possible.
Now, oh, I'm sorry.
Well, from what I've seen, the dynamics for companies to join OpenStack has always been getting faster to the market with new products. And I think that the same pressure is being applied to networking vendors. No one is big enough to compete with all the others when they join forces together. And there is really no way that this dynamic can be avoided. We've seen it in other fields as well. And this morning, Chris Anderson was mentioning it. The same sort of pressure coming from a group of joined forces against one. And there's no way that one can resist that pressure.
So I actually want to go a little bit more on this question, which is if I look at OpenStack, OpenStack obviously is open source, and there's been a lot of hype around OpenStack. Now what I'm noticing is there are a whole set of players tripping over themselves to offer a networking stack for OpenStack. There's some basic functionality in Neutron, but then there seem to be startups, some that are closed, some that are large companies that are closed, some that are open, some that are semi-open. Do you think that there's a need and there's a role for open source in open source networking specifically sitting underneath OpenStack, and if yes, why?
Absolutely. Again, it's a matter of the huge pressure. You can't build a cloud without having a very solid networking thing. You build a cloud on top of very solid and well designed, well thought out network. And that sort of need is now becoming very evident. That's why you see that sort of bubbling excitement around the networking field. And that's also where it's hardest to get it right. And one of the pain points is actually around that. It's really mandatory to get the networking bits correct and have them done well. I mean, you guys have, that's why there is this solid interest between collaboration in OpenStack and the rest of the NFV SDN environments.
I think there's an important piece here, which is historically network innovation equaled a level of standardization that went through standards bodies and slow processes. And in order to bring that, to improve the speed at which we innovate in the networking space, we need some common building blocks. And if the common building blocks don't exist, you've got a fractured environment, a bunch of different proprietary solutions or even fractured different solutions from partially open source. It's challenging to get that same economy of scale that you get with large, successful open source projects. So, yeah, I think that collaborating together to build a common building block is a fundamental key to being successful in this space.
Yeah, I would add, within the cloud networking domain, I mean, as you mentioned, you can have vertical solutions which are vendor specific, or you can have vertical solutions which are built according to in an open manner, but still addressing a certain need. I'm going to plug the OpenDaylight project now, but one of the things I see we really need is the concept of this platform, this component that allows you to address different types of networking, different behaviors, innovate across what is existing today, in one place, in a community that's accepting and willing to address those. And I think that's one of the things we have in OpenDaylight. Plug.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, question for Nolan. Something a little controversial, that's a controversial debate happening in our industry, right? I think it seems on one hand that most people at this point seem to agree that open source at the control plane layer makes sense. We totally need that, and we see sort of almost every major networking player participating in one or both of the major efforts there. Now, there's a question, is there a need for openness lower down in the stack? Do you think in general, as you work with, say, service providers, have you seen a need and a demand, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's the higher levels, have been much more active in opening up and becoming collaborative. But due to historical reasons, a lot of the lower levels kind of write on the hardware, and kind of the pieces of the system that are actually moving bits have been exceptionally proprietary. Someone will let you run a small Python script in a highly restricted environment on their gear, and this is considered very open. But it's very difficult to build a flexible and open platform on top of a closed and proprietary base. And so I think, from the hardware on up, you need the ability to be able to buy hardware and then install whatever software on it you want. It's kind of the transition from buying a Sun server with Solaris only, and that was the bundle, and that's what you got, take it or leave it, to being able to buy a server and being able to run, FreeBSD, Linux, something you wrote yourself for a specific use case. And then, kind of the next level up, being able to, once you've chosen the kind of next level, well, how do I integrate that with the level above me, whichever of the major kind of management and control plane tools, how can I integrate them with this piece in a way that I as the user control, as opposed to some fixed vendor specified integration?
Can you tell us a little bit more about ONI? What is it? Where did it come about? Why does it matter?
Sure. ONI, one of my, Matt Peterson, who's here, is a Cumulus fellow who describes it as Pixie that doesn't suck. And what it is it's a piece of software that we contributed to the Facebook Open Compute project, and it's the piece of software that's installed on the switch when it comes out of the factory. If you buy a OEM vendor switch, it has their OS on it when it comes out of the factory. But to provide this open ecosystem, we needed the equivalent of the BIOS and Pixie and installers and some way to actually put your own software onto these servers. Onto these switches, and so that's the role that ONI plays, and it's been kind of instrumental in providing this common abstraction layer where everyone can play both above and below it. So multiple OS vendors are currently shipping OSs that you can install using ONI, and there are many different hardware manufacturers, ranging from ODMs to OEMs, that are selling hardware that can have one of these OSs installed on them.
Right. And one last question for you is, why Linux? Why run Linux in networking? That I would have thought, everything sounds great. Why didn't you just reinvent it and build a purpose-built operating system for the network?
Very short answer, because you're already running it on your servers. All right, the value of that commonality across the board is huge. I mean, from the very basic step of, I'm SSH'd into a server and I'm configuring interfaces. I'm, typing if config. Well, I'm obsolete apparently. I should be typing IP link. And then being able to go to the switch side and type that exact same command and not have to then go look up the Cisco manual or the Arista manual or whatever and figure out what that proprietary command line interface is. And then similarly on the next step, all your automation tools you're already using on the servers, you can use on the switches as well, unmodified. And so, you've probably already got, say you've got a big cluster, you've got 10,000 servers, it's probably got, 500, 1,000 switches. If you can manage 10,000 servers, adding another 500 Linux elements should be very easy.
Makes sense. Cool. Question maybe for the other three. Wanted to transition a little bit. We've talked a lot about software-defined networking. And I think it's probably very exciting as a technology to many people in this room, but I'd love to sort of talk a little bit about the use cases. What is it that SDN is or will allow us to do that you can't do today?
It's everything to everyone. So it slices, it dices. Like my personal opinion is really focused around application internetworking, and that would be in the context of a cloud or a container orchestration system where you're trying to connect components of your application through a network where the applications are coming and going quickly. Usually we call this network virtualization because you're abstracting away the connections, the application level connections from the underlying physical connectivity. There's a wide variety of other ways to define SDN, but that's something that I spend a lot of my time focused on is network virtualization.
Yeah, I would add, so for use cases, there are a number of them. Obviously, the first one is the composition of a complex function in a virtual environment. In addition, SDN can be used for WAN services. It can be used for composition of complex functions across a network or within a data center. The scope of SDN is, well, yeah, as you say, everything to everyone, slice and dice the world. But there are some foundational use cases that really provide value. And if I can use Linux in my switch and my server, if I can use SDN in my data center and in the WAN, if I can use the same function, the same platform, the same component to achieve the same types of use cases in different environments, it saves me a lot of effort, it saves me a lot of time, and just makes life generally much easier.
And what I'm seeing in the SDN is how it's influencing other areas that were not really looking at agility in their DNA. They didn't have it, like the NFV, the network function virtualization aspects, and the telecom operators, how they're getting this new way of deploying networks and delivering new functions to the users in a very much more agile way. And it kind of freaks me out too, I have to be honest. I kind of thinking, because sometimes I think, I look at how the new corporations that have not been famously for their open collaboration, you mentioned it. It's one of the layers where there's been a lot of standardization and frozen application layers or frozen layers in general. And when I look at how we as a collaboration community, open source communities, how we've been teaching them how they can get faster, they can do better things, and then we get in exchange. I look at how we get Comcast that instead of being grateful, they treat us not well by telling Congress all the time how they should be selling bits at different prices because bits are different bits. For some reason, they try to convince Congress about that. Or AT&T that is, putting your cable at home, and at the same time they say, well, you know what, it's $70 if you allow me to sell the data that you produce on my networks, or plus $30 if we don't sell you anything. Yeah, I mean, if we don't sell you to other people. And I'm kind of like, oh, wait a second, we've been teaching you how to do open source, we've been enabling new business models, and now we're getting back this stuff. I mean, do we, as a community, have a moral imperative, and what is that when we do help corporations to do collaboration in this exchange? What do we get back?
So I heard from you, I think there's two major areas I heard you talked about cloud as a big one. Certainly you've been talking a lot about that. You also talked about NFV, network functions, virtualization, and I think you also, Chris, talked a little bit about it potentially impacts all the different networking that happens on campus, in the carrier, in the data center. So SDN can affect pretty much everything. I wanted to talk a little bit specifically about NFV. I don't know if everybody in the room is as familiar with NFV as the person who's wearing a sweatshirt that has those letters on there. So maybe I might start with you, Chris. Could you provide a layman's explanation of what is NFV? Because it sounds like it's just the virtualization of network functions, but I think it may be a little bit more than that.
That's exactly what it is. No. I spent the better part of my working career building vertically integrated network functions that get deployed in service providers across the countries. And NFV is really that industry, which is a big industry, it moves in standardization circles. We build these huge boxes, and then we know exactly how they're going to talk to every other box. And then the
So you're
challenge
talking carriers specifically here.
carriers, well, yeah, exactly, in the carrier space at least. So we spend a lot of time standardizing things and describing how things will talk to each other, and then we build these vertically integrated systems that can speak those languages. NFV is a great opportunity for us to essentially accelerate some of the cycles that we've gone through. If we can virtualize the applications or the functions, and if we can leverage open source and open source technologies, then we can inherently speak the same language because we're using the same components. We don't necessarily need to sit down and talk and describe and discuss everything. We can do it practically in code. But NFV, sorry, I got way off topic, but NFV is essentially the virtualization of what we used to build as vertically integrated solutions. It moves from just that very quickly into a how do we deploy networks in service provider networks across a country. I no longer have to put my boxes the same way that I used to. Now I can move functions, and I can invoke applications where I need them, which essentially then begins to change the way I operate my businesses, because now I can essentially create a virtual solution on the fly, and I'm able to monetize in different ways. And some of the challenges that service providers have now when it comes to how they give you your services in your house will change as NFV comes through, and all of a sudden the way that you're going to be charged for the services that are offered will also change. But this is it's a big change for the industry, and it's going to take a little bit of time, and of course there's going to be some rough water. But,
Yeah, NFV is interesting. 3 years ago, I think most of us had never heard of the term. It came out of a group in Europe, the Etsy ISG community. And I think back for me, I think where it really hit home is there was a meeting in which Jim Zemlin, myself, and I think Chris Wright were in a room together with a set of the top thinkers and architects in the carriers, representing pretty much all the major carriers in the world. And they expressed something very interesting at the time. They said, you know, we've been thinking about this. We've published a set of white papers. We've been trying to tell our vendors what they should build to meet our needs. And unfortunately, we're frustrated. We're not getting built what we need. And so we need to figure out, how do we do this? Do we go to OpenStack? Do we go to OpenDaylight? Do we go to OpenVSwitch? Do we go to CloudStack and all of those groups? Do we go to Linux, I guess? And tell them what they should do to make us happy. Or should we go build our own open source project and rebuild everything from scratch? That sounds expensive and a lot of work. Or is there something else? And I think the last couple of years, certainly, there's been a lot of movement, a lot of it in OPNFV, some in some other areas. Before we get right into OPNFV, I'm curious. I know Chris, for one, and maybe some of you also, have been talking to carriers over this time. Can you talk a little bit about what you have heard? What is the fundamental problem that they're trying to solve?
Well, without being overly dramatic, it's an existential crisis. Their revenue is falling. And
how do you really feel?
Yeah, no, I mean, they're really in a fundamental challenge where you've got massive growth of use of their network and diminishing ability to get any value out of that. And so one of the things that they're looking at is how do we move towards a model that represents the modern data center type of architecture. And this is, again, what Stephen was talking about with Google, Facebook, et cetera, these massive infrastructures that provide scaled solutions to a large number of users. The key component there for them is scale and open source. The most interesting thing is this is a fairly closed, historically closed environment, and open source comes up every single time. And one of the things that we hear, it's not just open source, it's not just take an open source project and mold it into an environment, it's open source that's also upstream. So these are projects that are, we know OpenStack, we know Linux, KVM, OpenDaylight, OBS, all these things. We don't want them to be forked and then put into environments in a way that we're now essentially vertically locked to a provider once again, and not able to recognize that the value and the scale of an open source project. So that, to me, that's the most exciting part. Open source, open source, open source from a historically very closed environment.
Yeah, and that comes, the open source mantra comes also with fast, fast, fast. And the only way to get anything done fast, rapidly, and delivered to a customer is through open source and through collaboration. The main challenge that I see in that aspect is that these companies don't have the DNA for collaboration. So a lot of good intentions, a lot of good practices also in the I would say the line. So the developers and some of the development teams have that habit of collaboration because they've been selected and hired to work on open source. But when we get to the upper management, we see a lot of resistance, at least in the OpenStack world.
I'm a little more optimistic because, to Chris's point about the existential crisis, that's the why they're looking at doing something different. And the kind of the how that seems to be settling out is getting the same sort of economics you get in a large-scale server cluster, but for these services that were, traditionally on these proprietary platforms. And you can't have the how without, engaging with upstream and upstreaming, because otherwise you'll end up with your own proprietary fork, and you're not back at square one, but maybe you're back at square two.
Right. So Chris, you talked about the components, and thank you, you added a couple that I'd forgotten, right? So you said OpenDaylight, OpenStack, Open vSwitch, KVM, Linux. Did I miss one? Zen?
I usually count on 7, so
DPDK, somebody throw out from the audience. Chris, can you talk a little bit about, okay, so we've got these components, they clearly want to use them. It sounds it's a little bit like automotive grade Linux, but maybe across multiple projects. What is OPNFV actually doing to try and solve these carriers' needs?
Yeah, so OPNFV was formed with a desire to create an open community where we could build a platform of these components, where we could make sure that it works, that we could make sure that it scales, and that we can iteratively improve and tune that to the needs of the consumers of that platform. So OPNFV doesn't intend to fork. OPNFV intends to be purely a collaborative project where we will work with those projects, of course, and that's our starting point, to bring them together to create literally a reference distribution, maybe is a good way to put it.
Reference distribution.
A reference distribution that you can, a reference implementation of essentially a data center infrastructure. So what we're doing is we're looking at what the ETSI NFV ISG group have been doing. We're looking at the infrastructure, the virtual infrastructure layer, so essentially targeting IaaS, and we're trying to work with upstream communities, so looking at what upstream communities are doing, trying to bring that in, trying to combine it together, running a number of tests, validations, running a number of applications, figuring out how to ease deployment of the types of applications that are coming out, and really trying to accelerate the cycle between vendors that are trying to produce network functions, the communities that are trying to work with those vendors to actually provide something that they can run those on, and the consumers of those. So we are a community of a number of service providers and consumers, network operators, a number of vendors, both in the virtualization space and in the networking space. And we're all sort of getting together to try and find a way, to find a common language, to find a common methodology, to really start to drive this forwards and try and accelerate the virtualization of networks, essentially.
So I'm curious about OpenStack, Stefano. So we heard both Chris's mention that OpenStack's a critical technology to be able to deliver on this need for NFV. Does the OpenStack community care about NFV? Do they talk about it? Are they building things? Are they reaching out? Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic within that specific community?
Yeah, well, it's actually fascinating because I might be wrong, but on the feeling I get, there is a lot of collaboration, first of all. There is a lot of there's been, and it still is, a lot of newcomers coming in the OpenStack. OpenStack started in the data center for internet providers, basically. And their needs are somewhat different from, or at least their use case is limited compared to enterprise adoption in private data centers for running enterprise or legacy, I would say, application workloads. And then when the NFV use case came in, it was kind of like, oh, wait a second, we were not thinking about that still. So it took a little bit of time for the existing community to come to peace and to understand that there are actually at least 3 major use cases for OpenStack, and all of them now, we are at the size where all of them can be followed and it can be acted on. So with the NFV teams, there is a very large visible community contributing code, contributing blueprints and new features and being added all the time. I think we have, if not a dedicated track at the upcoming summit in May, we definitely have a huge presence of NFV-related talks.
Now, sometimes we notice among open source projects, we're all about collaboration. As long as people collaborate with us doing it our way, right? And this is one of the sad things that sometimes happens within our community, is we get into these internal fights. And I'm curious, it would have been very easy for people in OpenStack to say, yeah, that all sounds great, but it should just all happen within OpenStack. Do you find there is, at times, that dynamic within the community? And what do you do sort of in your role to be able to quash that or to manage that?
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard, especially when you have to steer over 3,000 or around 3,000 people. And they've been all told to go after the data center use case. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a second, that's not a priority anymore for this cycle. And we release every 6 months, so we have kind of priorities set for 6 months timeframes. And all of a sudden we get new things that need to be done, and steering people away from one priority to another in a short term is frightening and freaks people out. So it takes a little bit of time. It takes time to convince the existing leaders that the new use cases are valid enough. And we've been putting in place a bunch of new work groups and reorganizations inside the community to be able to be ourselves more agile.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Add one thing to that, which is there's a potential impedance mismatch, which you alluded to, which is, we have our way, you have your way. How do we collaborate, meet in the middle? And so what Stefano's mentioning is creating a working group within this project, OpenStack, that helps onboard new people who just fundamentally don't have the experience or even the language to communicate. So we've got people coming from standards bodies that speak this obscure, arcane language that nobody in the OpenStack community understands. How do you turn that into like a real use case that actually doesn't look foreign to a enterprise data center use case? And that's actually been the biggest challenge, is translating requirements and making it sound like it's not special. There are a few key requirements that may end up being more restrictive in service provider environments, but many of the requirements are actually very similar. It's just when you express it in an obscure language, it sounds weird and not interesting.
Cool. New TLAs scare everyone.
To shift gears a little bit on this, to talk about the OpenDaylight side. As we look at it, still talking about NFV, as you look at this NFV group, can they just take OpenDaylight as is, or are there changes? How do you think about OpenDaylight in an NFV use case, and what do you think is going to be required to get to implementation?
Well, there's a key use case for an NFV environment that it really leverages the programmability that you get with SDN, which is you've got all these network functions. Historically, you kind of cabled them together. It was a fairly simple way or a fairly static way to assemble the pieces. Now, as you have functions that scale with demand of user demand and load, the functions land on different hosts. You need something that's sort of steering traffic through all those components. And OpenDaylight has the network virtualization piece for tenant isolation and cloud networking, but it also has some building blocks that actually Chris has been working on to do service function chaining. So the ability to define these abstract chains and turn those into actual packet flows through your network, which historically was switches and routers, but now it's functions that sit in x86 servers and virtual machines that look a lot like just applications.
I think as well as the capabilities of the controller itself, I think some of the areas, and we're at a collaboration summit, some of the areas that we need to work with OpenDaylight is working more closely with the OpenStack community, making sure that we're able to articulate the capabilities that we have so that OpenStack is able to leverage them in a better way. to have some sort of a common agenda across community. I mean, each of these components doesn't solve the problem on its own, right? That's really the challenge that we have right now. I see we have a number of communities and a number of activities, and everyone has the right ideas and everyone's heading in the right direction, but we're still sort of just not quite all exactly on board. And we don't have to be exactly on board, but we need to be well enough aligned that we're all making progress together. And I think that's one of the key things that we need to start to bring forward for NFV to really start to grow.
And I think this is, you're touching on something really important to me, which is one of the things I've noticed is it used to be that you had these different open source efforts. And for the most part, these collaborative projects were highly collaborative within the project, but there wasn't really a need for collaboration across projects. And what I've heard sort of all of you talk about is it sounds like, from an end user perspective, they need a solution that actually integrates multiple projects. And so can you talk a little bit about, what do we need to learn, what do we need to do to be able to gain that cross-project collaboration? How's that different from collaboration within a project?
It's challenging. It's
Yeah.
challenging. We've been trying very hard to reach out to other projects. I mean, OpenDaylight is one, but from the OpenStack Foundation perspective, also Docker and CoreOS is another area where we want to be able to have those communities also collaborate with us and us collaborate with them. It's something that is really necessary, but it's hard to achieve because of different cultures, different processes, different release timing, and roadmaps, and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly, so OPNFV, the project, my jumper, everything, we are an integration project, and that's what we intend to be. And we don't intend to reinvent anyone's projects, we intend to work with each of the projects. And exactly what you say, this is the biggest challenge, the timing of when the other projects are doing what they're doing and when they're releasing. Trying to coordinate across projects. I mean, we are a brand new project, so we have limited practical experience. We have a lot of experts with us who are helping to train our community in how to work with these other communities and provide that level of integration. Not just from plugging the software together, but community integration and agenda setting integration. I mean, these sorts of forward-looking activities, which we really need if we're going to be able to accelerate what we get out of this integrated solution. But it's top of mind for us. It's what we're here for. That's really the point.
Nolan, with Open Compute, have you seen Open Compute reach across the aisle and work with other projects, or is that more in its infancy? How's that been going?
Some. I mean, it's still relatively early for that, but there's a couple of different ways it happens. In the simplest, which is kind of weird when we're all here talking about software, but the folks making the hardware, have to engage with the various communities to make sure that the hardware they're building is what they need. Right, and so that kind of has started happening. Historically, the kind of hardware manufacturers built whatever they thought, and then people either bought them or didn't, and so it went. But now there's a much more open dialogue there, and then within the Open Compute project software side as well, there's various software projects like ONI. There's some other stuff coming that'll be announced in the next few weeks. That are kind of about bridging that gap and making it easier for kind of the higher level projects to consume this stuff, and also for them to kind of influence each other.
There's one thing that's important, which is you got to set your expectations appropriately. So when you look at an NFV use case that has these 7 different components, and you need to actually make a change that spans the Linux kernel, KVM, QEMU, libvirt, Open vSwitch, add DPDK, put OpenDaylight on top, combine it with OpenStack, and you want to make a change in every one of those layers, which we've actually had to do. That's just going to take time. That's all there is to it. You could do it very quickly in your own proprietary fork of all those projects, but to get those merged into the upstream project is going to take time, and the investment, the time investment is not just about writing the code, it's about establishing human trust relationships between developers in these projects, because we're humans. We're developers, we're writing code, we're working together, and if you don't build trust across these communities, then you're not going to be able to collaborate.
That's absolutely crucial. That's absolutely crucial. That's one of the reasons why you see conflict emerge between different interest groups or different projects, is because one and the other don't understand each other, don't understand the culture. So here comes someone and says, hey, I need this feature done. I need it done my way because I'm the expert in the field and you should just take it as it is. Well, that won't fly.
Okay. Well, I'm curious about that. You know, we haven't really talked much about governance, and there's some different governance models out there. You've got, you know, some projects that have benevolent dictators for life, some that are controlled by one company, others that are completely broad and open along the Linux model. Do you see any differences in terms of collaboration based on sort of the governance model that exists within the projects?
I don't know about governance within a project affecting cross-project collaboration. It absolutely affects the internals of a project and the ability to move quickly or not. And I definitely see some challenges in some of the larger, faster growing projects and how do they adapt and take on new developers. And you look at some of the backlogs of incoming code versus reviewed and merged code, and it shows that maybe we need better tooling, maybe we need better processes. Maybe it gets exaggerated when you add multiple projects together, but you know, getting one project working in an efficient and healthy manner is probably the more important factor.
Got it.
Yeah, I agree. As long as it works for the project itself, I don't judge. There is no better model, I think, as long as it works.
Okay.
You do find, I've heard stories of some curious engagements across project where a set of engineers across projects have completely agreed and they've all sort of been on the same page, and then one of the groups said, that was nice, thanks, now you've got to go and convince XYZ to make it happen because we can't do it. And you do get some interesting behaviors, but for most projects, I think as long as the power is with the guys that are on the ground, the guys that are making the difference and making the decisions, I think that's the right way to do it.
Okay, great. Well, we've got just under 3 minutes left, so I wanted to sort of do 2 questions in one, if we can. We haven't touched that much on data center and cloud, although I think many of the things that we talked about on the NFV side probably also apply. So I was hoping each of you maybe could do a closing statement on what you think we need to go forward, and maybe if you can touch a little bit on any differences, if you see any, with data center and cloud. Maybe starting with you.
Well, I think we're winning that war, thinking of it, and I think the collaboration that is happening inside the data centers or around cloud infrastructure and networking is really brilliant. It's what we were hoping to get out of when the open source movement started. So I'm pretty excited about that, and I can't wait to see the future.
Yeah, and I think where kind of the cloud is going will drag the data center on after it, the more traditional data center, and where the cloud going is pretty clearly open source everywhere, and in particular Linux everywhere, and so I'm pretty optimistic about that.
Great. I think it's the Wild West, it's the very beginning. We have cool components all over the place, but if you look at the OpenStack Neutron network management for VMs or Docker Kubernetes management for network management for containers, those are typically the pain points in those projects. So we're running as fast as we can to fix those. And what I think is really exciting is everything is changing. So it's not just the sort of run Linux on a switch. It's what a switch is changing. The blurred lines between an x86 server and a RISC or a MIPS-based switch is what will fuel the next generation. And you look at the wedge or these newer architectures that allow you to put varieties of functionality in your network that are also a key part of your application. That's where we'll start to see this fundamental change.
Right. Yeah, I think the Wild West is a great way to describe kind of where we are from a technology perspective. I wake up every day dizzy. It's really fun. I think what I would like to see is some foundation pieces coming out. I mean, on the talk about Docker this morning, there was that discussion around, okay, we would like to be able to define this, and then you have a stake in the ground, and then you can innovate around and over that. And we need to iterate through that process. We need to keep rolling. We need to keep innovating. We shouldn't stop someone doing something. We should be accepting of new ideas, accepting of new concepts, and we should try and forge some sort of a foundational pieces where it makes sense at this point in time. I mean, the townships out in the edge of the Wild West, they may live or they may not, but we need to sort of work towards those and create room for the next level of growth to come through.
Great. Well, to close this out, wanted to say a couple things that I see. As we've been talking about, we've made great progress on the technology standpoint in open networking. And as I look forward for the rest of the year, 2015, it is clear to me, is the year that this technology starts impacting users. It's been amazing to see some of the largest telcos in the world, some of the largest service providers in the world, some of the largest enterprises in the world beginning to plan to test, and we'll soon see them rolling out by the end of the first quarter of this year. And so I think that we will all learn a lot when we go from building what we think is the perfect architecture to seeing its impact out there. I think the second key theme that I see, and we've been talking a lot about it today, is that we need to go beyond simply collaborating at a small level, whether it's 4 people in a room or these larger projects, and increasingly collaborating across multiple different dimensions. Many of these projects are bigger and more complex than any early open source projects that existed in the past. And so we've seen our challenges of getting collaboration among different individuals, among different sub-projects, but increasingly now even among multiple projects, including huge projects like OpenDaylight and OpenStack. And I think that this, with every generation, there's a question. People look at this and say, will this collaboration work? It seems to a lot of people who haven't done this that there are a million reasons why we'll just all fall apart and go do things in our own way or just go build companies. And it's amazing that I think what we're seeing is collaboration can work. It's not easy. People wake up every day and seem to think that you can put an open source license and throw some code on GitHub or open a GitHub page and you have an open source community. And we know that's not the case. Many of you in this room have taught it to us. And so I think this is going to be the year that end users are impacted, and this is also the year that we will really see cross-project collaboration take hold. And with that, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.